Even to this day, developer Starbreeze Studios' 2013 classic, Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, is fondly remembered. As an adventure puzzler, released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 just months before the next console generation, it packed a real emotional punch for those that caught it. Jump forward 11 years then, and we have a new remake for PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S in our hands today, opening the game up to a new generation. In terms of its technology, it moves from the original's Unreal Engine 3 to the latest Unreal Engine 5, and to make the most of that engine upheaval, Milan-based studio Avant Garden puts in serious work to update every location, to reimagine every character and environment with vastly improved detail via UE5's Nanite and Lumen technologies, to add new cutscenes, tweak its controls and difficulty. Even its soundtrack is re-recorded from scratch, with original composer Gustav Grefberg returning to the project. Despite all of those changes, it's a relief to find great care has been taken to stick closely to the original's core gameplay, though the move to new technology allows the team to greatly enhance the way the world and cutscenes are presented. So how does Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons remake compare to the original 2013 version? And secondly, does the quality of the experience hold up well on an Xbox Series S next to PS5 and Series X? Or are serious compromises in place? And finally, as ever, what of performance? Bearing in mind we get two modes on every console, a capped 30 FPS quality mode and an unlocked 60 FPS performance mode. Let's find out. First off, I will say that even with the remake's many visual changes, the gameplay loop of Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons sticks close to the original 2013 version. From the main menu design to the physics of its puzzles, the game logic running underneath is often identical. As before, you take control of two brothers, simultaneously in a top-down view, which is a peculiar setup that has each one controlled via either analog stick. The goal? To navigate an eerie, beautiful fantasy world full of trolls, wolves, and sentient trees, in a quest to find a cure for their dying father. Each chapter opens up increasingly more devilish ways to mix and match each boy's abilities, so the elder of the two is able to pull heavy levers, while the younger sibling is thin enough to slip through small cracks. It takes 2 to 3 hours to finish, so really not a big commitment time-wise, and given the game's length, I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum here. So, onwards to the comparisons. From the very first frame, the jump to Unreal Engine 5 opens up a suite of visual upgrades. We'll talk on the resolution specifics in a minute, but I'm using the PlayStation 4 version to show the original release up against the PlayStation 5 version on right for the remake. In the remake, the geometry is reworked entirely from scratch. UE5's Nanite technology is deployed in every case to create more geometrically complex meshes, allowing for these intricate rock formations lining the coast. Later on, the wooden planks of this elevator contraption and the cobblestone floors of the town below are embellished with nanite to add more height and more definition. Really, it's in the cutscenes, above all, where the camera lays low to the ground, that the benefits of nanite stick out most. It's obviously a huge leap over the designs of the original. Meanwhile, added grass and foliage detail fill out the space, we get greatly upgraded water shaders across the river, while we also see a more advanced depth of field, film grain, and light shafts woven into the scene. But perhaps the most substantial change beyond this is the remake's lighting. Again, thanks to UE5's Lumen, a real-time global illumination system, the team is able to introduce diffuse bounce lighting. And so, a brightly lit surface will now bounce light and its colour over to nearby geometry. Especially around interiors, it brightens shaded areas with a simulated light and colour bounce to create this much more realistic result. Next up, it's impossible to ignore the remake's new character designs. The materials used across each model see a huge improvement, with textures presenting fine stitching on cloth, while the upgraded skin shaders allow for more realistic interaction with light. But the best bit is the way that their facial details come alive in the remake. We get more expressive eye animations, blinking, and even mouth movements now. The upgrade is so stark, in fact, that Avant Garden adjusts the camera work to now squeeze in as many close-ups of each character as possible. Now, the 2013 original has a genuine charm to it, even today. Call it a minimalist charm. And certainly, for those who grew up with that version, it may prove hard to accept all of these changes. In fairness, the top-down gameplay still looks beautiful in the original, but it's also clear that in seeing the two brothers up close in the remake, we benefit from the more detailed animations. Across the breadth of the adventure, every story beat is replicated, but the camera movement, the animation work, and the editing are altered to put the new facial detail into focus. Interestingly, certain cutscenes are pre-rendered now, like the very first scene in the storm. On top of that, cutscenes are also added in spots, like this jump onto the falling bridge. It kind of helps to add context to the next segment of gameplay, but otherwise, so much of the remake is synced up in terms of the story with the original. Overall, the remake avoids falling into the rather modern trap of updating the visuals at the expense of playability. The environments are still very easily legible despite the new lick of paint here. And a few other extra changes deserve some mention. A proper two-player co-op mode is included in the remake, which is a first for any PlayStation or Xbox release, having only been added to the original version on Switch. Controls are updated also to give the running movement, and especially the turning animation, a more modern feel. Outside of that, there are myriad smaller tweaks and improvements, but let's tackle the graphics modes next. PS5, Series X, and S get two graphics options in the menus, a 30fps quality mode and a 60fps performance mode. But if you have 60fps in mind, and I can understand why you would, be warned it does come with some big drawbacks on each console. First up then, let's look at the default 30fps quality mode. A form of temporal reconstruction is used here to create the impression of a higher res 4K image, but the true numbers are much lower than that. On PS5 and Series X, for example, we get a dynamic range of 1260p up to 1620p, with more typical native resolutions like 1440p coming in between. 4K might be the target here, but it's rarely, if ever, in sight. Otherwise, there isn't really anything else to divide the two premium consoles in visual features. As for Series S on the far left here, the differences are more pronounced. In terms of resolution, it drops to a lower range of between 454p and 720p, though in the quality mode, it does tend to rest at the upper end at 720p. Still, regardless of which resolution it uses, image breakup is very evident on Series S. It calls to mind other UE5 titles supporting Lumen and Nanite, in fact, like Immortals of Avium or Lords of the Fallen, which also dipped well below 720p on the console. So this isn't an isolated case. Once again, Series S's image quality visibly suffers in a bid to keep these features in line with PS5 and Series X. It goes well beyond resolution though. To keep performance in check, the 4 teraflop console runs with lower quality shadows, textures, and a lower quality depth of field effect. Grass density and ambient occlusion are also massively pared back compared to the PS5 and Series X versions. All of which means, in outdoors areas, you'll notice bushes appear with less shading, and the corners of the world appear lighter. Okay, next up, switching all three consoles over to the performance mode, we get a 60fps target and we keep Lumen and Nanite in place all round. However, something obviously has to give in terms of resolution in order to essentially double the refresh to 60. On PS5 and Series X, this means we're typically running at 1080p. Potentially the number could go higher, but 1080p is a constant figure in every sample so far. We also get low quality shadows in this mode on PS5 and Series X compared to the quality mode, but otherwise, much of the visual setup stays in place. And then, on Series S, we keep the same range in terms of resolution between 454p and 720p. Lumen and Nanite are kept, however, it trends towards the lower end of that spectrum to 454p in a bid to hit 60fps. The result being more visual noise, more artifacts on hair, and flickering where the depth of field effect appears. Later chapters, in the dungeon for instance, fare better. Series S will tend to run at 720p in these less taxing interiors, but it's still a glaringly low figure next to the competition. What's the payoff in frame rate performance then? Kicking off with the 30fps quality mode first, I'd strongly push this as the recommended way to play the remake. It's evenly frame-paced for a start. It's also a locked 30 with no drops on PS5 and Series X, besides these hitches due to the game autosaving between areas. The autosaving blip is distracting but not exactly game-breaking. There's no GPU side bottlenecks to speak of though, which gives us this clear 30fps line across every chapter. Now, 60fps purists will no doubt have a bone to pick here, but for certain slower-paced games in this vein, it's surprisingly a non-issue to play at 30fps. The camera pans slowly across the screen, while the puzzles don't tend to involve any really timing-sensitive inputs. On PS5 and Series X in my experience, 30fps doesn't notice as much as you'd expect. And if we switch over to Series S, again, it's clear sailing across the entire adventure. At least, almost. If I'm nitpicking, there is one particular segment at the very end of the first town, which lurches into the mid-20s. It's really unfortunate and it's jarring, but I'm glad to say the rest of the game has played well at 30. So, despite the heavy visual compromises on Series S in resolution, shadows, and ambient occlusion, it does at least pave the way for a solid frame rate. All of that leaves the performance mode. To be blunt, this mode is really intended for VRR-enabled TVs, capable of adapting to a range of frame rates. Most cutscenes will run at 30fps regardless, but gameplay kicks off across the first town at an unlocked 35 to 60fps. It wavers up and down the grid all the way through the town streets on both PS5 and Series X. Interestingly, Series X has a consistent frame rate lead at every point through here, so check this out. On PS5, standing at the start of this winding mud track puts us at the 45fps mark. Switching over to Series X though, that jumps to 51fps, or put another way, a 13% performance gain on Microsoft's machine, and this applies across the entire opening town area. The point being, VRR-compatible displays will be served more frames per second to work with using a Series X machine, which in turn might produce more perceptually smooth results. Though beware that there are still spots that drop below the ideal VRR range. Again, this bridge on the town outskirts hammers PS5 and Series X performance pretty hard, right down to the mid-30s. On the flip side, later chapters like the underground dungeon run constantly at 60fps on each, so there's a win here. If you're able to stand the resolution and shadow quality hit on performance mode, this part at least does hit the mark. But emerging to the overground again to fend off the wolves, or for the mountain goat riding part, both PS5 and Series X are battling to hit that 60fps line all the way through. All of which leaves the Series S version on the performance mode. Honestly, this isn't the way to play. Even factoring in its lower resolution and all the visual cutbacks, the performance level is worse than PS5 and Series X. To go back to that example at the start of the winding mud track, Series S runs at 39fps constantly, while stood still. It's a step lower than PS5's 45fps line, and it makes it less palatable for VRR supporting displays in any outdoor areas. Yes, the dungeon segment runs perfectly at 60fps, and the resolution does bump up closer to 720p in that chapter, so you could potentially swap to the performance mode just for this part on Series S, but the 30fps quality mode makes a lot more sense for the rest of the game. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is handsomely remade on current-gen machines, and it's a winning effort based on the visual upgrades. The jump to Unreal Engine 5 makes way for a beautiful, fresh take on the original story, and the character redesigns truly benefit in close-up, but the remake is not without fault. Just as with other recent UE5 titles making use of Nanite and Lumen, like Immortals of Avium, getting the game running at 60fps is evidently a challenge for PS5, Series X and S. A trend is forming here. Deep cuts are again made to image quality to help keep all these UE5 features in place, but none of these consoles manage to lock at 60. If we're comparing all three, Series X does give the best frame rates overall, which means VRR display users might find value in the game's performance mode on that machine at least. But for most cases, especially on a Series S, the 30 FPS quality mode makes more sense for a consistent experience. Also, it must be said, the remake in its launch state does suffer from a few bugs. Mostly these are small visual blips, like flickering shadows or texture pop-in, but equally, I had one character get stuck in the geometry, forcing me to resort to a checkpoint restart. The 2013 original was no stranger to these issues either, but it does need addressing. Of course, many will have a strong attachment to Starbreeze Studios' original work, for nostalgic reasons, or perhaps because the simplistic, minimalist nature of the visuals lent itself to the story. It's a very understandable stance to take, but supposing the game passed you by in the last 11 years, the remake today offers a great, visually updated way to see out the same adventure. And speaking as someone who hadn't played any incarnation of the game until now, the story is still truly affecting. It carries the same emotional weight, regardless of which version you pick. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe as ever, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.